Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'm curious how many of you found this video late at night, when the world is quiet and your mind begins to wander into places it probably shouldn't. Tonight we're going to talk about a book you were never meant to find, a book that doesn't exist, and yet has left a trace in thousands of texts, games, and whispered conversations. The Necronomicon. You've heard the name. Maybe you've even seen a fake copy on a bookstore shelf, or stumbled across an online forum claiming access to the real version. But what if the most frightening thing about the Necronomicon isn't that it's real, but that it reveals what reality actually is? This documentary is not a guide for summoning. It's not an occult tutorial. It's something much stranger, a literary autopsy of an idea that refuses to die. Over the next 4 parts, we'll trace the origins of the Necronomicon, decode its philosophical core, follow its appearances in literature, and examine how it continues to infect culture. Our approach is investigative, historical, philosophical, but be warned, by listening, by thinking about this text, you've already stepped over a line. Because the Necronomicon was never meant to be read. It was meant to be remembered and feared. The Necronomicon emerged during a specific intellectual moment, not from occult practice, but from literary necessity. H.P. Lovecraft began referencing the book in the early 1920s, first clearly naming it in The Hound, 1922, during a period marked by scientific upheaval, post-war disillusionment, and the collapse of Victorian certainty. Einstein's general relativity had already destabilized intuitive notions of space and time by 1915. Darwin's implications had long eroded theological centrality. By the 1920s, humanity was no longer the moral or spatial center of the universe. Lovecraft did not invent the Necronomicon to frighten readers with magic. He crafted it to formalize a worldview in which human systems of meaning were already obsolete. Lovecraft's letters make this intent unusually explicit. Writing to Clark Ashton Smith in 1929, he described his fiction as an attempt to express cosmic indifference rather than supernatural evil. This distinction matters. The Necronomicon functions not as a spell book, but as a textual embodiment of that indifference. It records truths that pre-exist humanity and will outlast it. Here, horror does not arise from malevolence, but from scale. Not a curse inflicted upon humans, but a revelation humans were never designed to withstand. We must pause here. Lovecraft was not warning against forbidden rituals. He was dramatizing the consequences of accurate perception. The choice to attribute the book to Abdul al-Hazred reflects both literary strategy and cultural anxiety. Lovecraft situated its origin in the 8th century, a period associated, through Western misconception, with arcane scholarship, translation movements, and esoteric knowledge. Baghdad, Damascus, and Sana'a were not random locations, but symbolic sites of ancient learning beyond European lineage. This was not admiration, it was distancing. By placing the book outside Western rational tradition, Lovecraft made it plausibly ancient and conveniently inaccessible. The strategy mirrors earlier literary devices, from the lost Greek tragedies to the apocryphal Gospels excluded from canonized scripture. Yet Lovecraft's method went further than precedent. Unlike Mary Shelley's fictional science or Poe's pseudo-philosophy, the Necronomicon was embedded within a network of fabricated scholarship, translators, editions, dates, and institutional custodians. The 950 CE Latin translation by Olaus Wormius, the suppression of copies by ecclesiastical authorities, the rumored presence of a volume at Miskatonic University. This density of reference created what scholars later identified as false academic scaffolding. Consider this carefully. The book feels real because it obeys the bureaucratic logic of real knowledge systems. The historical context also includes Lovecraft's deep pessimism toward modernity. The mechanized slaughter of World War I, which ended only 4 years before his first Necronomicon reference, confirmed his belief that human progress was an illusion. Industrialization, urbanization, and mass politics appeared not as advancement, but as entropy accelerating. The Necronomicon reflects this worldview precisely. It does not promise power, enlightenment, or salvation. It catalogs cycles, alignments, and thresholds, nothing more, a triad worth noting. The book documents how reality behaves, not how humans might control it. Comparisons clarify Lovecraft's originality. Unlike the biblical Book of Revelation, which frames apocalypse as moral reckoning, the Necronomicon presents catastrophe as routine, cosmological process. Unlike Faust's grimoires, which trade knowledge for damnation, this text offers knowledge without negotiation. And unlike Borges's infinite libraries, which overwhelm through excess meaning, the Necronomicon terrifies through meaning's absence. Not forbidden because it is evil, but forbidden because it renders ethical categories irrelevant. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's intent. Horror arises when interpretation collapses. It is tempting to frame the Necronomicon as a clever metafictional joke. Lovecraft himself occasionally encouraged this reading, amused by readers asking librarians for copies. But that interpretation is incomplete. The book's endurance suggests something deeper at work. Why did this fictional object escape its author's control? Why did readers insist it must exist? The answer lies in timing. Lovecraft articulated a fear his era could not yet name, that modern knowledge was uncovering truths incompatible with human psychology. The Necronomicon did not arise in a vacuum. Though wholly fictional, it stands atop a long lineage of cultural archetypes, grimoires, apocrypha, and esoteric revelations that both fascinated and terrified their readers. To understand the Necronomicon's resonance, we must investigate the intellectual soil from which it was cultivated. In doing so, we uncover not merely historical echoes, but philosophical foundations, especially the human compulsion to externalize forbidden knowledge in the form of a book. First, the archetype of the forbidden text predates Lovecraft by millennia. Ancient Mesopotamian temple libraries restricted access to cuneiform tablets dealing with demonic invocation or astral omens. The Hellenistic Greeks believed in apocrypha, secret teachings hidden from the masses, passed only to initiates. In late antiquity, Gnostic sects claimed divine knowledge had been corrupted and suppressed by false gods. These traditions share a recurring theme, that truth is both precious and dangerous, and that writing can imprison or unleash it. The Necronomicon embodies this paradox. It is a book meant to preserve knowledge too destructive to exist. Here we find clear affinities with the Jewish Sefer HaRazim, a 3rd century compendium of angelic rituals only revealed to the worthy. Likewise, the Book of Enoch, excluded from the biblical canon, contains visions of heaven, punishment, and time itself, material the early church deemed too destabilizing. Lovecraft's fictional grimoire is not modeled after one source, but rather the idea of knowledge deliberately set apart from orthodoxy, preserved in fragments and shadows. Crucially, the Necronomicon reflects not just content, but form. Medieval grimoires, such as the Key of Solomon and the Picatrix, structured their dangerous knowledge in ritualistic layouts, sigils, invocations, precise orders of operation, requiring not just intellect, but submission. These were not casual books. They demanded compliance. Similarly, Lovecraft's Necronomicon exerts power simply by being opened. Its influence is passive and architectural. It does not compel, it allows. And that allowance is damning. Philosophically, the Necronomicon inherits the deep anxiety of Heraclitean flux, the notion that the universe is in constant transformation, ungraspable by fixed human concepts. Lovecraft, a known admirer of pre-Socratic pessimism, infused his mythos with this instability. Yog-Sothoth, for example, exists simultaneously across all time, rendering causality irrelevant. The book that describes such a being must itself destabilize time, language, and perception. In this sense, the Necronomicon is not a book about horror. It is horror as ontology. Gnostic cosmology offers another instructive parallel. In Gnosticism, the material world is often the creation of a false god, an ignorant demiurge who traps souls in flesh and illusion. Secret knowledge, gnosis, allows liberation. Yet, in Lovecraft's inversion, such knowledge does not liberate. It reveals that there was never a creator at all, only forces beyond comprehension. The Necronomicon becomes an anti-Gnostic gospel, not a key to escape, but a document confirming the prison was always infinite. Culturally, the Islamic Golden Age, 8th to 13th century, from which Lovecraft fictionally draws Abdul al-Hazred, was a time of immense scientific, mathematical, and philosophical advancement. Yet Western imagination often exoticized this period, turning scholars into mystics and libraries into temples of cryptic wisdom. Lovecraft exploited this projection. Abdul al-Hazred is not a character. He is an icon of orientalized intellect pushed to the brink of madness. His madness is not incidental. It is the price of knowing. Through this device, Lovecraft grafted modern epistemic dread onto pre-modern mystique. A rhetorical question emerges here. Why do so many cultures imagine forbidden books rather than forbidden ideas? Perhaps because a book promises containment. It localizes threat. It tempts with the illusion that horror can be controlled by reading and avoided by not reading. But in the case of the Necronomicon, this logic is reversed. The book is not a repository of evil, it is a conduit. It does not describe forbidden knowledge, it enacts it. Even within Western literary tradition, there are parallels. The Faust legend, codified by Goethe, revolves around a scholar who seeks absolute knowledge and gains damnation. But Faust chooses. In contrast, the Necronomicon often chooses its reader. Consider Randolph Carter or Walter Gilman, drawn not by ambition, but by inexplicable pull. The reader does not master the book rewrites the reader. In sum, the Necronomicon's cultural and philosophical antecedents include grimoires, apocrypha, pre-Socratic pessimism, Gnostic inversion, and the Western exoticization of foreign wisdom. It is not a pastiche, but a synthesis, an object that reflects our deepest suspicions about knowledge, perception, and the limits of language. As we move forward, we must ask how such an artifact could be constructed to feel not only plausible, but inevitable. The name Necronomicon exerts a strange authority. It sounds ancient, authoritative, and vaguely Greek, but not quite right. This is intentional. Lovecraft fabricated the word, and in doing so, crafted more than a title. He created a linguistic trapdoor, a name that implies knowledge of the dead, but obscures what kind of knowledge and for what purpose. The etymology is a misdirection and a signal. Lovecraft himself offered a pseudo-Greek breakdown: nekros, dead; nomos, law or custom; and icon, image, rendering something like an image of the law of the dead. But the construction is linguistically dubious. Greek scholars have noted that Necronomicon violates standard classical formulation, blending terms in ways no ancient writer would. Now, this is the point. The book exists outside legitimate textual tradition while mimicking it. It is a foreign body posing as canonical. The strangeness of the name invites misinterpretation, and that ambiguity becomes part of the myth. Is it a book about the laws that govern the dead, or a book authored by the dead themselves, or perhaps a catalog of the dead's customs, violations, and punishments? The name does not answer, it echoes. This deliberate imprecision makes the title feel both precise and unknowable, like a word recalled from a dream in fragments. Beyond the title, Lovecraft consistently employed symbolic language that suggests meaning while withholding it. Terms like non-Euclidean geometry, cyclopean masonry, or eldritch resonance do not describe. They evoke. They point toward phenomena that exist outside linguistic containment. The Necronomicon, in its scattered quotations, follows this same linguistic strategy. It is not the content of the sentences that disturbs. It is the recognition that language is insufficient to express what is glimpsed. Consider the recurring claim that certain passages are untranslatable or indescribable. This is not laziness, it is function. The book is constructed not only to contain horror, but to perform it through syntax, rhythm, and absence. This aligns with Jacques Derrida's later idea of hauntology, the sense that language is always haunted by what it cannot say. The Necronomicon is not a haunted text. It is hauntological in form. Lovecraft also introduces invented languages: Aklo, Reliehian, Tsathyo, and others scattered across his mythos. These tongues are not meant to be learned. They are meant to simulate the experience of cognitive failure. When read aloud, they are said to summon visions or entities, a concept echoed decades later in the idea of the info hazard, a phrase or idea so dangerous that comprehension itself causes damage. The Necronomicon thus becomes a textual virus, not information passed, but structure infected. We must pause here. In most Western traditions, sacred or forbidden texts are understood to convey meaning, revelation, prophecy, wisdom. The Necronomicon breaks this model. It does not convey, it transmits. Its words are not symbols for things. They are the things, or the keys to them. The symbol and the symbolized collapse into each other. This is where its linguistic horror lives. Compare this with the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, as above, so below. A dense aphorism, but one rooted in metaphor. The Necronomicon's language, by contrast, is literal without referent. When it speaks of the angles which slumber, or the gate that is the key and the guardian, it does not mean something else. It means exactly what it says, and that precision is terrifying because it cannot be visualized. The book's Latin and Greek fragments, often cited through fictional translators like Olaus Wormius, add a layer of false legitimacy. These are the scholarly languages of medieval theology and philosophy, once the gateways to sacred and forbidden knowledge alike. By couching madness in scholastic tongues, Lovecraft constructs a paradox, a book that appears to belong to the canon of learned discourse while dismantling its foundations. We are not just reading Latin. We are reading the collapse of Latin as a vessel for truth. The Necronomicon's symbolic vocabulary is filled with triads: the key, the gate, the guardian, past, present, future, mind, matter, void. These clusters operate like incantations, compressing complex metaphysical relationships into rhythmic forms. Triadic language has ancient precedent, from Trinitarian theology to Hegelian dialectics, and is often used to stabilize meaning. In the Necronomicon, it destabilizes. The terms do not resolve into synthesis, but spiral into recursion. Even the physical descriptions of the book contribute to its symbolic language. Bound in human skin, inked in blood, locked with sigils. These are not just horror tropes. They reflect the idea that meaning requires sacrifice. That knowledge, to be real, must exact a price in flesh, sanity, or time. The Necronomicon thus becomes a text in which the medium is part of the message. Grotesque, arcane, and deliberately obscured. In closing, the Necronomicon's name and language are not accidental flourishes. They are integral to its effect. Its etymology simulates ancient authority while violating linguistic rules. Its symbols suggest unspeakable meanings while evading clarity. Its language is not a bridge to knowledge. It is the abyss over which knowledge trembles. To explore how Lovecraft deepened this illusion into narrative credibility, we must now examine how he built the myth of the Necronomicon, not just its form, but its authenticity. The Necronomicon's enduring power lies not in its content, of which little is ever directly revealed, but in how convincingly it feels real. Lovecraft didn't merely invent a fictional book. He embedded it in a world so methodically textured with false citations, layered chronologies, and intertextual echoes that many readers still question whether it ever existed. This is narrative authenticity through myth-building, the construction of a lie so carefully scaffolded that it behaves like truth. To achieve this, Lovecraft borrowed from the conventions of scholarly and religious authority. The Necronomicon is not presented as a standalone object, but as a text with a traceable history. Written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred in the 8th century, translated into Greek by Theodorus Philetas of Constantinople, then into Latin by Olaus Wormius in 1228. These details are fabricated, but their specificity mirrors the bibliographic trails of real medieval manuscripts. By anchoring the book in a lineage of fictitious translators and banned editions, Lovecraft mimics the apparatus of historical transmission. He also incorporated the book into his fictional institutions. Miskatonic University's Orne Library holds one of the few surviving Latin copies. Other rare volumes exist in the British Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale, the University of Buenos Aires, and even the Vatican archives. These names are not obscure. They are credibility factories. Their inclusion performs a sleight of hand. By mentioning real places alongside fictional texts, the unreal becomes nested within the plausible. Moreover, Lovecraft scattered references to the Necronomicon across dozens of stories, often in passing. In the Dunwich Horror, Dr. Armitage uses it to understand the invisible monster. In the Dreams in the Witch House, it appears alongside real grimoires like the Malleus Maleficarum and the Book of Zion. This interweaving accomplishes two effects. First, it normalizes the book. It is treated as one resource among many. Second, it saturates Lovecraft's mythos with recurring echoes, making the Necronomicon feel like a foundational document beneath the surface of multiple narratives. We must pause here. This strategy reflects a deliberate embrace of pseudo-scholarship, where fictional texts are treated with the analytical reverence typically reserved for real ones. Lovecraft does not explain the Necronomicon. He footnotes it, He references editions, discrepancies, translations, and interpretive disagreements, precisely how scholars debate religious or philosophical texts. The authenticity emerges not from explaining the book, but from behaving as though its authenticity is unquestioned. This approach was later formalized by his successors. August Derleth and the editors at Arkham House treated the Necronomicon as part of a broader mythos taxonomy. They cataloged fictional works, unaussprechlichen Kulten, Kulte de Ghoul, the Pinacotic manuscripts, with cross-references and publication dates. These were not parodies. They were contributions to a shared literary conspiracy, a consensual hallucination that blurred fiction and folklore. What Lovecraft began as metafiction, others elevated into a collaborative mythology. The line between hoax and homage eventually dissolved. In the 1970s, booksellers began offering supposed real editions of the Necronomicon. Most famously, the Simon Necronomicon, which combines Sumerian cosmology, occult ritual, and Lovecraftian references into a cohesive, if spurious, text. These works were not endorsed by Lovecraft's estate, but their popularity speaks volumes. Readers wanted the book to exist. More provocatively, they behaved as though it already did. This phenomenon invites comparison to religious apocrypha. Just as lost gospels or forbidden scrolls claim to reveal hidden dimensions of faith, the Necronomicon offers secret knowledge obscured from mainstream perception. But unlike canonical texts, its power derives from its exclusion. It is not revered because it is authoritative. It is revered because it is discredited. This inversion is vital. The Necronomicon's authority is not derived from approval, but from suppression. The success of Lovecraft's myth-building also rests on a cultural shift in how readers approached fiction. In the early 20th century, the boundaries between reportage, fiction, and pseudo-history were more porous. Pulp magazines often printed letters from readers treating stories as real events. Sensationalist archaeology and mystical pseudoscience, think Atlantis, ancient aliens, or spiritualist research, blurred lines between fact and narrative. Lovecraft exploited this ambiguity, constructing a myth that could comfortably exist within disbelief. And that is the final secret of the Necronomicon's authenticity. It doesn't require belief, it permits it. By mimicking the structure of hidden knowledge, by nesting itself in real institutions and documents, by being referenced across a corpus rather than detailed in one place, it behaves exactly as a real suppressed text would. You don't need to read the Necronomicon to believe in it. In fact, the less you know, the more you suspect. The Necronomicon is often mistaken for a magical text, a grimoire designed to invoke power. But its true horror lies elsewhere. It is not a book of spells, but a book about structure, of the universe, of time, of consciousness. To read it is not to gain mastery, but to perceive something incompatible with human cognition. The core philosophical concepts encoded within its mythos are not occult. They are ontological. The Necronomicon reveals a cosmos governed by insignificance, entropy, and unstable reality. These are not beliefs, they are conditions. First and foremost is the concept of cosmic insignificance. In Lovecraft's mythos, human beings are not chosen, central, or protected. They are irrelevant biological accidents inhabiting a small, dim corner of a vast and indifferent universe. The Necronomicon affirms this by documenting entities so immense, so temporally unbound, that humanity's entire history registers as less than a blink. Cthulhu dreams beneath the sea, not because it is waiting, but because time does not matter to it. Azathoth spins at the center of all things, blind and idiot, not as punishment, but because order is a human projection onto an orderless real. We must pause here. Most philosophical systems, even nihilistic ones, still presume the importance of human consciousness. Despair implies a fall from potential. The Necronomicon contains no such presumption. It offers no fall, because there was never a place to fall from. There is no Eden. There is only disorientation. A second core concept is entropy, not merely as thermodynamic decay, but as epistemological erosion. In traditional cosmologies, knowledge builds upward, observation to theory to mastery. The Necronomicon inverts this. Knowledge dissolves understanding. As characters study its pages, coherence disintegrates. Linear time distorts. Language unravels. The deeper the inquiry, the less stable the inquirer becomes. This is not simply madness, it is cognitive entropy. Thought loses fidelity. This connects to a broader philosophical anxiety rooted in the early 20th century. The rise of quantum mechanics, non-Euclidean geometry, and probabilistic models of the universe challenged classical certainty. Lovecraft transposed these uncertainties into horror. The Necronomicon is the textual equivalent of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. By attempting to observe reality too closely, the observer collapses the frame that once gave them stability. Knowledge is not light, it is corrosion. The third and perhaps most disturbing concept is what we may call dream reality instability. In Lovecraft's stories, dreams are not symbolic reflections of the unconscious. They are alternate states of contact. The Necronomicon, when read, often shifts the reader's frame of reference from waking world to dream continuum. Most clearly in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath and The Dreams in the Witch House. But these are not dreams in the Freudian sense. They are adjacent realities with their own ontological status. This undermines the Enlightenment assumption that the waking world is primary. In Necronomicon logic, dream and waking states are lateral dimensions, and human perception of reality is simply a matter of where the lens is pointing. The book destabilizes that lens. It is not just a text, it is a bridge. And the act of reading it may shift the reader permanently into a position from which consensus reality no longer appears whole. Consider the implications. The Necronomicon does not describe another world. It describes this world as it truly is, once the illusions of coherence are stripped away. In doing so, it suggests that human sanity is not a condition of truth, but of limitation. The mind protects itself not by confronting reality, but by ignoring its deeper architecture. This connects to Lovecraft's most cited philosophical statement from The Call of Cthulhu. The most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. The Necronomicon, then, is not dangerous because of what it contains. It is dangerous because it correlates. It forces connections between data points we were never meant to integrate, dimensional overlaps, non-human epochs, recursive timelines. Once those correlations are made, the illusion of coherence collapses. A rhetorical question emerges here. Is it better to live in ignorance or to suffer clarity? The Necronomicon offers no answer, only exposure. Its horror is not what it says, but what it reveals was always already true. In this sense, the text functions less like a map and more like a mirror, reflecting not where we might go, but what was beneath our perceptions all along. These philosophical foundations, insignificance, entropy, unstable reality, set the tone for everything that follows. They also explain why contact with the Necronomicon leads so often to madness. Not because the book is evil, but because it is accurate. And accuracy, when applied to cosmic structure, is corrosive to meaning. The Necronomicon does not simply describe a hostile universe, it catalogs the beings that inhabit it. These are not gods in any traditional sense. They are not creators, saviors, or destroyers. They are conditions. The so-called Great Old Ones and Outer Gods that populate its fragmented passages are not characters, but metaphysical structures, principles masquerading as presences. To name them is to misunderstand them. Yet they are named, and that act, naming, becomes both the reader's tether to meaning and their invitation to dissolution. Foremost among them is Yog-Sothoth, described not as a god, but as a totality. It is the gate, it is the key, it is the guardian of the gate. This triadic formula, repeated in multiple stories, invokes the logic of self-canceling paradox. Yog-Sothoth is not merely a being, it is the structure of space-time access, the awareness through which time is perceived, and that which perceives all time simultaneously. To invoke Yog-Sothoth is to collapse linearity. It does not arrive. It reveals that it was always there, watching from outside duration. Compare this to any anthropomorphic deity from ancient religion: Zeus, Odin, even Brahma. Those figures are elevated humans, jealous, wise, punitive. Yog-Sothoth is nothing of the sort. It lacks motive because it is not an actor. Its presence in the Necronomicon signifies a shift from narrative theology to topological metaphysics. It is not the storm. It is the logic that allows storms to be possible. Then there is Cthulhu, arguably the most recognizable of Lovecraft's pantheon. Cthulhu's form, a humanoid shape with cephalopod features and membranous wings, is deliberately incompatible. Its very anatomy suggests biological convergence from a non-human logic. But Cthulhu's true function is not aesthetic. It embodies the idea of dormant threat. It sleeps, dreams, and influences the world from beneath the sea, not because it is evil, but because it is waiting for conditions to shift. The Necronomicon frames Cthulhu not as a demon, but as a signal. Its dreams invade the minds of the sensitive. Its return is not an apocalypse, but a reversion. Humanity, we are told, will scream and kill and revel when it rises. Not because we are corrupted, but because we will remember what we were before intellect subdued instinct. The being becomes a mnemonic rupture, a trigger for biological memory written into flesh. A third entity often cited in scattered passages is Azathoth, the blind idiot god who sits at the center of all chaos, surrounded by piping flutes. The image is grotesque, a nuclear metaphor, a black hole deity, or perhaps an allegory for the absence of authorship in the universe. Azathoth is not evil, it is mindless. And that is what makes it terrifying. It suggests that all creation emanates not from intention, but from stochastic convulsion. We must pause here. In most cosmologies, beings at the center of creation are sovereigns. In Lovecraft's world, the center holds precisely because there is no one holding it. The Necronomicon, by placing Azathoth at the axis of existence, replaces divine reason with cosmic automatism. Everything flows from nothing, not as nihilism, but as the only available truth. Other entities, Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath, the faceless ones in the Dreamlands, populate the margins of the Necronomicon. Each represents a further permutation of existential dislocation. Nyarlathotep is the exception, a being that does act, often taking human form, spreading madness deliberately. But even this agency is unclear. Is it malevolence or simply the unfiltered consequence of higher dimensional logic brushing against our limited frame. In many fragments, the Necronomicon refers to these beings not by name but by title or description: the crawling chaos, the black goat with 1,000 young, he who is not to be named. These aliases function as semantic diffusers. They imply precision while withholding it. The reader can sense the shape of the force, but never pin it down. This is consistent with Lovecraft's commitment to unspeakability. Not that these names are secret, but that language itself fails under the weight of what they signify. It is significant that no full taxonomy of these beings is ever presented. The Necronomicon, across its scattered citations, never provides a pantheon, a hierarchy, or a cosmological chart. This absence is intentional. The book is a record, not a theology. It describes not what is worshipped, but what is encountered. And those encounters are almost always asymmetrical. The human perceives the entity. The entity does not notice the human. A rhetorical question follows. How does one study something that erases the studier? The Necronomicon offers no tools for protection, only notation. Its role is not to prepare the reader, but to document those who failed to comprehend. It is a memorial of epistemic incursion. In closing, the entities described, or alluded to, within the Necronomicon are not characters but structural flaws in reality. They are not enemies of humanity. They are indifferent proofs that humanity was never central. They signify that existence is not ordered, but entangled. And in the next section, we must confront what happens when such forces intersect directly with the human mind. For the Necronomicon does not only describe these beings, it allows their echo to inhabit those who read it. We now turn to madness, not as metaphor, but as the system's response to the incompatible. The Necronomicon does not simply exist as a passive artifact in Lovecraft's mythos. It exerts an effect. Its pages do not merely reveal horror. They induce it. Human interaction with the Necronomicon consistently results in madness, obsession, or death. Not because the text is cursed, but because it destabilizes the very structure of human cognition. The book functions as a philosophical contaminant, epistemologically active, psychologically corrosive, and ontologically incompatible with the human frame. To understand this function, we must first recognize that madness in Lovecraft's fiction is not a failure of mind, but a logical consequence of confronting reality without illusion. In traditional Gothic literature, madness is often the product of guilt, trauma, or supernatural intrusion. In the context of the Necronomicon, it is epistemic, born from knowing too much. The reader loses their sanity not because they are weak, but because they are accurate. Consider the figure of Randolph Carter, who appears across several Lovecraft stories. His persistent exposure to dream realities, ancient texts, and metaphysical truths eventually culminates in his dissolution. He becomes not enlightened, but diminished, not destroyed, but rewritten. This is a common trajectory. The Necronomicon does not merely impart information. It alters perception at the structural level. Readers do not learn, they transform. This transformation typically follows a predictable arc. First, curiosity, often intellectual or professional. The protagonist is a scholar, an investigator, or a seeker of hidden truths. Then comes revelation, an encounter with the book that opens perception to a broader alien reality. And finally, unraveling, as meaning itself collapses. The individual becomes detached from language, time, or self. We must pause here. This arc mirrors a ritual structure: initiation, passage, and reconstitution. But in the case of the Necronomicon, reconstitution is either failed or non-human. The reader emerges not wiser, but post-human, or not at all. This is why madness is not a side effect of the Necronomicon. It is its ritual output. The consistency of this pattern across Lovecraft's stories suggests intentional design. In The Dunwich Horror, Dr. Armitage survives his exposure to the Necronomicon by maintaining analytical distance, yet even he describes its contents with terms like blasphemous and impious, revealing a residual cognitive recoil. In The Nameless City, the narrator's mental deterioration accelerates as he reads inscriptions resembling those in the Necronomicon. The text doesn't just describe horror, it enacts it, line by line. This aligns with a modern philosophical concern, the idea that certain knowledge is incompatible with the human operating system. In contemporary cognitive science, there is growing recognition that consciousness relies on filtering, not receiving, information. The mind protects itself by ignoring vast swathes of sensory and conceptual input. The Necronomicon bypasses that filter. It is not simply dangerous, it is structurally disallowed by the dirty brain's architecture. Madness, then, is not the loss of order. It is the collapse of a false order and the exposure of a deeper, incommunicable truth. This is why Lovecraft's descriptions of madness rarely involve hallucinations or delusions. Instead, they involve sudden clarity. Characters become aware of dimensional overlaps, temporal distortions, or biological irrelevance. Their language becomes fragmented, not because they are confused, but because the tools of syntax no longer apply. A rhetorical question must be asked. If knowledge produces madness, is ignorance a virtue? The Necronomicon seems to answer yes, but only with irony. Ignorance protects sanity, but also seals humanity in illusion. Madness is the cost of accuracy. Thus, the book presents a cruel dilemma: to know and unravel, or to remain intact and blind. Importantly, the Necronomicon's effect is not always immediate. In some stories, its influence unfolds gradually. Dreams become disturbed. Thoughts drift toward unexplainable subjects. Language begins to echo rhythms or symbols from the book. This slow dissolution reflects how the text behaves more like a virus than a revelation. It does not overpower. It replicates within the psyche. This viral quality is amplified by the Necronomicon's selectivity. Not all who encounter it are affected equally. Sensitive minds, those attuned to ancient truths, or who already dwell on the edges of perception, are more vulnerable. This introduces a quasi-Darwinian filter. Those most capable of understanding are those most likely to be destroyed by the act. It inverts the hero's journey. Here, survival signals failure to grasp the deeper meaning. The book is, in effect, an instrument of epistemic collapse. It strips away assumptions about time, self, causality, and agency. It does not destroy the mind violently. It dismantles its internal architecture and leaves it running without cohesion. What remains is not insanity in the medical sense. It is post-rational subjectivity, a being aware of structures it cannot express, and therefore unable to participate in reality. The Necronomicon occupies a peculiar place in the architecture of fictional knowledge. It is not feared because it deceives, nor because it summons. It is feared because it reveals. More precisely, it reveals what should never have been knowable, and what cannot be unknowable once perceived. This is the essence of forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft's universe. Not moral danger, but epistemic rupture. To read is to fall, not into evil, but into irreversible understanding. In most religious or mythic traditions, forbidden knowledge is transgressive because it challenges divine order. Prometheus stealing fire, Eve biting the fruit, Faust trading for wisdom. These acts defy hierarchy. But the Necronomicon does not operate within a theological framework. It is not transgressive because it offends the gods. It is forbidden because it destabilizes the reader's capacity to organize reality. Its danger is structural, not spiritual. This is why the Necronomicon is not merely a dangerous book. It is an ontological contagion. The knowledge it contains is not about monsters or magic. It is knowledge that monsters are the universe's default condition, and that what we call order is an artifact of human limitation. Once exposed, that limitation no longer holds. Language, time, identity, these collapse under the weight of truths that were never meant to fit inside a human mind. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's mythos does not fear the unknown. It fears the unfiltered known. The Necronomicon peels back the protective illusions of causality and moral structure. It does not add danger to the universe. It removes comfort. What's left is a cosmos without narrative, populated by entities without intention, governed by laws that ignore consciousness entirely. This epistemic collapse is not metaphorical. In stories such as The Call of Cthulhu, The Whisperer in Darkness, and the Dunwich Horror, the Necronomicon serves as the catalyst for a profound disintegration of interpretive stability. Readers of the book often report dreams, distortions in time perception, and untranslatable insights. These are not hallucinations. They are signs that the mind is encountering a framework it cannot contain. Lovecraft often hints at this with phrases like, too horrible to describe, unutterable shapes, or non-Euclidean geometry. These are not evasions. They are dramatizations of epistemic breakdown. The Necronomicon resists full quotation because its content cannot be stabilized into language. To read it is to experience the limits of semiotics, where signs no longer point to things and meaning collapses inward into noise. A rhetorical question becomes unavoidable. Why write a book at all if it cannot be read without destruction? The Necronomicon suggests a brutal answer. The universe is not written for us. The knowledge exists, whether it is comprehensible or not. The book simply records what is already true. In this sense, the Necronomicon is less a grimoire and more a black mirror, showing us not what might be, but what already is, beneath perception's mask. This idea resonates with contemporary philosophical anxieties. Thinkers such as Michel Foucault, Thomas Metzinger, and Eugene Thacker have explored how knowledge can dissolve the subject that holds it. Thacker, in particular, argues that the world in itself is inaccessible. Any attempt to describe it ends in horror, because to know the world is to confront the void where meaning fails. The Necronomicon is that confrontation, mythologized. This leads us to the concept of cognitive contamination, an idea now common in speculative fiction, but rooted in Lovecraft's stories. The Necronomicon is not dangerous because it teaches evil, but because it teaches truths that break cognition itself. To read it is to become alien to one's own thoughts. The mind becomes a foreign landscape. The self becomes uninhabitable. We might compare this to nuclear knowledge in the 20th century. Once atomic theory matured, humanity could no longer unknow the mechanisms of annihilation. The revelation did not just change warfare, it restructured geopolitics, ethics, and temporality. The Necronomicon, within Lovecraft's fictional frame, operates similarly. It is a point of no return. To encounter it is to recognize that human frameworks are not shattered by evil. they are dissolved by accuracy. And here is the final cruelty. The Necronomicon offers no conclusion, no redemption, no mastery. It is not a puzzle to be solved, but a fracture to be endured. Those who survive its pages do not emerge stronger. They emerge disoriented, shattered, aware that the world they once navigated with language, science, or faith was a comforting dream. In closing, forbidden knowledge in the Lovecraftian sense is not forbidden by decree. It is forbidden by nature. The Necronomicon does not forbid access. It forbids coherence. What it reveals cannot be integrated. It can only be witnessed, and in that witnessing, the witness is rewritten. The Necronomicon was never introduced with fanfare. It slipped into Lovecraft's fiction through a footnote, a parenthesis, a passing reference. This method of introduction, casual, scholarly, almost offhand, was precisely what made it so effective. The earliest appearances of the Necronomicon were not framed as revelations. They were framed as citations. This technique did not create a myth. It allowed one to accumulate. Its first explicit mention appears in The Hound, 1922, a story about grave robbing and obsession. Here, the Necronomicon is referenced with the cool neutrality of an established authority. We read much in Alhazred's Necronomicon about the black rites of the dead. The book is presented not as a curiosity, but as a source, text, as if the reader is already familiar, or at least expected to treat it with academic seriousness. The assumption of familiarity is the first layer of myth-making. By 1926, in The Call of Cthulhu, the Necronomicon had become a linchpin in Lovecraft's growing web of cosmic lore. The narrator references it as a source of knowledge about Cthulhu, a being whose cult and physical properties transcend ordinary classification. The Necronomicon is again cited without exposition. The madness and the blasphemy in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred had never failed to evoke a shudder. Note the phrasing. The reader is not being taught about the Necronomicon. They are being reminded of it, folded into the illusion that it is already part of a wider canon. This recursive referencing, where one story assumes the authority of another, became Lovecraft's hallmark technique. We must pause here. What Lovecraft was constructing was not just continuity, but intertextual density. By embedding a fictional book within multiple narratives and referencing it through diverse voices, he created a sense of depth that mimicked how real scholarly or religious texts behave. The Necronomicon became not a plot device, but a shared citation, linking disparate events across centuries and continents. For instance, in The Dunwich Horror, 1929, the Necronomicon is used by Dr. Armitage to decipher the nature of Wilbur Whately's monstrous lineage. Here, Lovecraft quotes directly from the text, an unusual move. Nor is it to be thought that man is either the oldest or the last of Earth's masters. This passage is notable because it provides not only content, but tone. The syntax mimics archaic theological language, part King James Bible, part occult Latin. The Necronomicon is not merely referenced here, it speaks. And in doing so, it expands beyond an object. It becomes a voice in the story, one with its own cadence and authority. This phenomenon becomes more apparent when the Necronomicon is referenced alongside real texts. In The Dreams in the Witch House, Lovecraft mentions the Necronomicon in a library that also holds the Malleus Maleficarum, the Book of Dzian, and the Pnakotic manuscripts. Some of these are historical, others are fictional. But the juxtaposition is what matters. By placing the Necronomicon among real grimoires, Lovecraft performs a literary sleight of hand. Reality and fiction blur. The Necronomicon also functions as a metatext, a book that exists within the narrative, but also shapes the narrative structure. In The Thing on the Doorstep, the text is mentioned in the context of forbidden rites and identity dissolution. The character Edward Darby becomes a reader, then a victim. This internal recursion, the reader within the story echoing the reader outside, creates a feedback loop. The Necronomicon doesn't just influence plot. It influences reader behavior, compelling us to seek patterns, track references, and engage with the myth as though it were research. This technique aligns with the modern concept of the hypertextual mythos, a network of stories, characters, and ideas that overlap without formal hierarchy. The Necronomicon operates as the anchor point in this structure. It is the unifying thread, not because it explains the mythos, but because it connects its disparate pieces. And this connection is achieved not through detail, but through distributed resonance. The Necronomicon never tells the whole story. It echoes across them. Another important point: Lovecraft never gives us the full book. We see fragments, paraphrases, occasional quotes, but the Necronomicon remains elusive. This partiality is crucial. It mimics how ancient and sacred texts survive, in scraps, citations, redactions. By refusing to present the complete work, Lovecraft increases its verisimilitude. It feels real because we never fully see it, only its effects. As other writers, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and later August Derleth, began referencing the Necronomicon in their own stories, its reality expanded. It passed from fiction into pseudo-history, from private invention into collaborative myth. The book became a shared hallucination, a fictional document treated as a real one by an ever-growing circle of creators and readers alike. In closing, the Necronomicon's early appearances were not central, but peripheral. That was the strategy. It entered the mythos not with spectacle, but with scholarly weight, a background presence that became a foreground force. In the next sections, we will examine how this subtle embedding shaped two major stories in particular, the Dunwich Horror and the Dreams in the Witch House. Each showcases a different function of the Necronomicon, one as revelation, the other as rupture. If the Necronomicon is the intellectual spine of Lovecraft's mythos, the Dunwich Horror, 1929, is the story that most clearly exposes its vertebrae. It is here that the Necronomicon functions not just as an artifact of suggestion, but as a tool of resistance, rare among Lovecraft's works. The story presents a cosmological incursion from beyond the visible world, and it is through the Necronomicon that this incursion is understood, tracked, and ultimately confronted. But the confrontation offers no triumph, only containment, and the chilling realization that the greater horror remains untouched. At the narrative's center is Wilbur Whately, a prodigious and unnatural child born in the decaying hills of rural Massachusetts. His rapid growth, preternatural strength, and obsession with arcane texts mark him as something other. From an early age, Wilbur seeks the Necronomicon, not for knowledge, but for function. He is attempting to open the gates between worlds, to allow his father, Yog-Sothoth, to emerge fully into our plane. This is a critical distinction. The Necronomicon is not portrayed as a magical object, but as a technical manual. Its role is not to grant power, but to provide the formulae, language, and geometry necessary to align reality with the alien logic of extra-dimensional forces. It is a bridge builder, a codex that permits communication with non-human systems. In this way, it behaves more like a physics textbook than a spell book. Lovecraft provides one of the few direct quotations from the Necronomicon in this story. Nor is it to be thought that man is either the oldest or the last of Earth's masters. The old ones were, the old ones are, and the old ones shall be. This passage, rhythmically recursive and temporally disjointed, encapsulates the Necronomicon's linguistic style. It is not narrative, it is ontological assertion. It does not tell a story, it declares a structure. The implication is clear. Humanity is a temporary inhabitant of a reality it neither understands nor owns. We must pause here. What makes this quotation so disturbing is not its content, it is the tone of certainty. The Necronomicon speaks in absolutes. Its function in the Dunwich Horror is not to frighten through ambiguity, but to disarm through finality. There is no hope. There is no special place for mankind. There is only sequence, and we are not at the beginning or end. Dr. Armitage, the Miskatonic University scholar who ultimately thwarts Wilbur's plans, is one of the few characters in Lovecraft's universe who engages the Necronomicon without succumbing to madness. This anomaly requires examination. Armitage treats the book academically, as a hazardous source to be approached with method, not desire. He does not seek enlightenment. He seeks containment. His use of the Necronomicon is tactical, not spiritual. Yet even Armitage does not emerge unscathed. His descriptions are laced with unease. He refers to the text as unholy and its contents as unnatural. He may retain sanity, but the framework of his world, its moral structure, its anthropocentric confidence, erodes. The Necronomicon in this story does not drive him mad. It drives him older, more brittle. His survival is physical, not philosophical. The climax of the story involves a cosmic confrontation between human scholars and the invisible offspring of Yog-Sothoth, Wilbur's twin, an unseen entity rampaging across the hills. The Necronomicon is not shown to banish this force. It merely provides the language necessary to communicate with it. The scholars do not defeat the being. They plead with it. They do not destroy the gate. They delay its opening. This is crucial. The Necronomicon does not offer victory. It offers terms. In the Dunwich Horror, the horror is not the monster. It is the context the book reveals, that the monster is expected, inevitable, and only barely held at bay. The narrative ends with a revelation. The invisible terror is Wilbur's sibling, half human, half Yog-Sothoth, a being whose existence was made possible through rituals derived from the Necronomicon. It speaks in broken English, pleading to return to the outside, to the space beyond reality. Its voice is childlike, mournful, and wholly alien. It is not evil. It is misplaced. This final exchange underscores the Necronomicon's central function in the story, not to describe monstrosity, but to contextualize it. The book gives form to that which would otherwise remain incomprehensible. In doing so, it grants temporary clarity, but at the cost of long-term certainty. What we understand, we can no longer deny, and what we can no longer deny must haunt us. In summary, the Dunwich Horror offers a rare case where the Necronomicon is used, not merely mentioned. It becomes a functional artifact, an operating manual for managing the incursion of the inhuman into the mundane. But the story's resolution is not hopeful. It is administrative. The threat is not resolved. It is filed away, its paperwork incomplete, its return inevitable. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, stands as one of Lovecraft's most iconic stories. not because it features a monstrous revelation, but because it presents horror as a pattern, stitched together from fragments no single mind was meant to correlate. In this structure, the Necronomicon plays a deceptively subtle role. It does not dominate the narrative, nor does it drive the plot forward. Instead, it operates as a metatextual frame, a whisper behind the story, anchoring its disjointed horrors in an established cosmology that shouldn't exist, but somehow feels like it does. The story unfolds as a dossier compiled by Francis Wayland Thurston after inheriting his late uncle's papers. The central mystery, the rise of cult activity, disturbing dreams, and seismic disturbances, only makes sense once the reader aligns multiple sources: anthropology notes, police reports, personal journals, and a carved bas relief. The Necronomicon, mentioned briefly but precisely, functions as the glue that binds these pieces together. It confirms that the events described are not isolated. They are part of a cosmic recurrence. Lovecraft introduces the Necronomicon during Thurston's recounting of Professor Angel's research into the Cthulhu cult. The general impression left by the horribly aged Arabic manuscript was one of unquestionable authenticity. Though the story does not quote the book directly, it tells us that Angel used it to verify ancient rituals, symbols, and the name of Cthulhu. In other words, the Necronomicon provides semantic consistency across discontinuous data. It becomes an ontological stabilizer. If the same phrase appears in dream, cult chant, and ancient manuscript, it must be real. We must pause here. The Necronomicon's role in the Call of Cthulhu is not narrative. It is epistemic. It allows disparate phenomena to be connected across time and geography. Its very existence encourages the reader, and Thurston, to correlate contents that would otherwise seem unrelated. This is the core mechanism of Lovecraft's horror. The idea that meaning can emerge where there should be none, and that this meaning is worse than ignorance. Unlike in the Dunwich Horror, where the Necronomicon is a manual for containment, here it is an index of recurrence. It catalogs that which has happened before and that which will happen again. It does not tell the future. It confirms the cycle. The cult's chant, Finglui Mglwunaf, Cthulhu Relier Gachnagel Ftagen, finds echoes in dreams, artwork, and rituals, and the Necronomicon authenticates it by simply mentioning it. That alone is enough to make it terrifying. This reflects a deeper philosophical point. The Necronomicon, as used here, embodies the horror of pattern recognition. Lovecraft's most quoted line appears in this story. The most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. The Necronomicon is the tool undoes that mercy. It correlates, it connects, it shows that what we thought were isolated absurdities are reverberations of a hidden architecture. This is not a descent into madness. It is a rise into unbearable clarity. Importantly, the Call of Cthulhu never uses the Necronomicon as a source of action. No one reads from it. No spell is cast. Its power lies entirely in its presence, its ability to affirm. This creates a different kind of horror than in the Dunwich Horror. There, the book is a tactical object. Here, it is a semantic anchor, proof that the impossible has historical precedent. The effect is cumulative. Readers already familiar with Lovecraft's mythos recognize the Necronomicon as a mythological constant. Its presence in this story, however brief, signals that the narrative belongs to a wider, darker order. Its inclusion makes the story feel smaller, in a way, less like an isolated horror, and more like a footnote in a cosmic archive. It is not the story of Cthulhu's rise. It is the story of one instance in a recursive loop of contact, retreat, and return. The narrative ends not with closure, but with submission. Thurston, having pieced together the truth, does not act on it. He writes, "I shall never sleep calmly again when I think of the horrors that lurk ceaselessly behind life." The Necronomicon has played its role. It allowed the pattern to form. The rest is psychological gravity. Understanding leads to paralysis. Knowledge has no utility. It has only cost. We must ask, why does such a brief reference to a fictional book carry so much weight? The answer lies in narrative accumulation. The Necronomicon appears across stories, but it functions differently in each. Here, it is a whisper. Elsewhere, it is a voice. This variability gives it credibility. It behaves as a real historical text would, sometimes central, sometimes peripheral, always present. In closing, the Call of Cthulhu uses the Necronomicon not as a source of action, but as a signal. Its presence tells the reader that what is being uncovered has precedent, that others have known, recorded, and failed to survive the same knowledge. The horror is not the thing itself. It is realizing the thing is real, recurring, and already documented, in a book no one should read, and everyone seems to find. The Necronomicon did not remain confined to Lovecraft's private mythos. After his death in 1937, it was carried forward by a network of admirers, correspondents, and imitators, some of whom Lovecraft had directly influenced, and others who discovered the book's allure secondhand. What began as a metafictional artifact, anchored in careful ambiguity and epistemic unease, was soon transformed into something new, a collaborative scripture, expanded by many hands, interpreted across genres, and occasionally believed in. This transition from literary device to pop occult phenomenon is not an evolution. It is a mutation. And like all mutations, it reveals both the resilience and fragility of the original form. The most significant figure in this expansion was August Derleth, Lovecraft's friend, publisher, and mythologizer. Through Arkham House, Derleth curated and republished Lovecraft's work, while simultaneously reshaping the mythos in ways that Lovecraft himself might have found deeply suspect. Derleth reinterpreted the Necronomicon and the entities it described through a quasi-Christian lens. The great old ones became evil, the elder gods became good, and the Necronomicon became a sort of demonic grimoire to be used or resisted in a cosmic moral conflict. We must pause here. This was not an act of betrayal so much as a shift in cosmic framing. Lovecraft's universe was indifferent, amoral, governed by scale and entropy. Derleth's version introduced duality, a battle between light and dark. Under this system, the Necronomicon became dangerous, not because it revealed unbearable truth, but because it aligned the reader with cosmic evil. It began to resemble other occult books in Western tradition. The Clavicula Salomonis, the Book of Abramelin, or even Faust's grimoire. This moralization softened the Necronomicon's epistemic horror. No longer a book that dissolved reality's framework, it became a tool within a theological system. This reframing allowed later writers to use the Necronomicon more easily. It could be quoted, summarized, invoked. But something was lost, its former ambiguity, its silent indifference, its ontological threat. Other authors approached it differently. Clark Ashton Smith, whose baroque, decadent style diverged from Lovecraft's cold formalism, used the Necronomicon sparingly. For him, it was less a device of cosmic scale and more a poetic relic, a whisper from civilizations drowned in their own splendor. Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan, referenced the book in Tales of Ancient Sorcery, grounding it in a prehistoric past rather than an alien future. In These Hands, the Necronomicon adapted. It behaved like a shape-shifting citation, reflecting the tone and worldview of the writer invoking it. By the 1960s and 70s, the line between fiction and hoax began to blur. The most infamous example is the so-called Simon Necronomicon, 1977, published by the mysterious Simon, who claimed to have synthesized ancient Sumerian ritual texts with Lovecraftian elements. Printed in faux antique design, filled with sigils, chants, and ritual instructions, the book was marketed as both a literary curiosity and a genuine magical tool. It sold in the hundreds of thousands. The Simon Necronomicon is not a forgery. It is a performance. It deliberately walks the line between artifact and act, exploiting the textual gaps Lovecraft left open. And in doing so, it reveals something important. The Necronomicon's power lies not in what it contains, but in what it withholds. Readers project onto it what they most fear or desire: secret history, forbidden, power, metaphysical coherence. The Simon edition simply provided a stage for that projection. Other real editions followed. The George Hay Necronomicon, with a fake introduction by Colin Wilson, the Hay-Wilson-Turner version, the Latin Codex Dagonensis. Each presented itself with faux scholarly gravitas, complete with invented bibliographies, spurious citations, and facsimile pages. These were not written to deceive maliciously. They were written to participate in the myth. The Necronomicon had become an open-source scripture, its authorship distributed, its canon unstable. Parallel to these literary and occult appropriations, the Necronomicon also infiltrated popular culture. In films like The Evil Dead, 1981, it became a book of demonic summoning, bound in flesh, inked in blood. In comics, games, and music, it was often stripped of its ambiguity and reduced to a prop, a shorthand for dark knowledge, without philosophical depth. The more it appeared, the less it meant. But even in its dilution, the idea endured. A rhetorical question arises. Does this collaborative evolution strengthen or weaken the Necronomicon's original effect? On one hand, the proliferation has made it culturally immortal, a concept known to millions, even those who've never read Lovecraft. On the other hand, the very clarity given to it in later expansions erodes the original horror. The Necronomicon's power lies in its incompleteness. Once it becomes a readable book with chapters, diagrams, and instructions, it ceases to be a trapdoor for epistemic collapse. In closing, the Necronomicon's post-Lovecraftian life illustrates a paradox. The more it is written, the less it needs to be real. It lives now in suggestion, parody, contradiction, and belief. It is no longer just a fictional grimoire. It is a cultural interface between fiction and faith, a text that is feared not for what it says, but for what it might say if only someone could find the real one. By the mid-20th century, the Necronomicon had slipped its fictional leash. What began as a literary invention, a metafictional device embedded in cosmic horror, began to appear in bookstores, whispered conversations, and the back corners of occult subcultures. Unlike most fictional texts, the Necronomicon became something stranger, a book that shouldn't exist, but somehow does, not because it was found, but because it was believed. In this phase, the Necronomicon ceased to be a narrative object and became a mythological contagion, spawning hoaxes, sightings, and so-called leaked editions that blurred the line between fiction, folklore, and delusion. The most infamous of these mutations is the Simon Necronomicon, first published in 1977. Ostensibly compiled by a shadowy figure named Simon, the book claimed to be an authentic occult manuscript drawing from Sumerian and Babylonian sources. Bound in black, filled with sigils, and written in cryptic prose, the Simon Necronomicon mimicked the form of a genuine grimoire. It featured ritual instructions, invocations of Lovecraftian entities, and detailed gate-walking procedures. But most critically, it never broke character. It presented itself not as pastiche, but as revelation. We must pause here. The success of the Simon Necronomicon, over 800,000 copies sold, is not attributable to literary curiosity alone. It tapped into a growing hunger for forbidden authenticity. In a post-1960s countercultural landscape marked by distrust of institutions and a surge in esoteric experimentation, the idea that Lovecraft's fiction might be a cover for real ancient truths felt plausible. In that sense, the Simon edition became not a hoax in the malicious sense, but a participatory myth, an open invitation to believe. Its popularity encouraged others. The George Hay Necronomicon, 1978, featuring an introduction by Colin Wilson, offered a different approach. It posed as an academic facsimile, complete with pseudo-historical commentary, fabricated citations, and speculative linguistics. The text read like Borges filtered through occult paranoia, an artifact that seemed just real enough to ask questions, but never real enough to answer them. This technique, of writing around the book rather than within it, reinstated some of Lovecraft's original epistemic distance. The horror was not in what it said, but in what it implied. Alongside these books came reports of real sightings, a recurring trope in online forums, occult communities, and fringe publications. Claims circulated that a copy of the Necronomicon was hidden in the Vatican secret archives, that another was stored in a CIA black site, or that a rare Arabic edition surfaced briefly in a Cairo bazaar before being disappeared. No evidence ever emerged, but the myth endured. Why? Because the Necronomicon is structurally designed to be undiscoverable. Its power depends on its absence. The moment it is fully known, loses the horizon of dread it projects. This makes it ideal fuel for urban legend. Like the Man from Taured or the Philadelphia Experiment, it exists in liminal plausibility, too elaborate to dismiss, too inconsistent to confirm. The internet accelerated this process. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, PDFs claiming to be the Necronomicon circulated widely, often poorly translated, generically occult, but wrapped in mystique. Some were little more than cut-and-paste jobs from earlier hoaxes. Others attempted elaborate reconstructions based on clues scattered across Lovecraft's stories. Still others embedded subliminal imagery, claiming to trigger dreams or visions. Here, the Necronomicon became a hypertextual entity, its presence scattered across hyperlinks, message boards, and creepypasta narratives. A rhetorical question arises. Why does this particular fictional book generate such persistent belief in its physical reality, when so many other invented grimoires are dismissed as plot devices? The answer may lie in the psychological shape of the Necronomicon myth. It is not a book of spells, but of reality rupture. It promises not power, but perspective. And that makes it strangely attractive, not to power seekers, but to those looking for an explanation behind the veil. This attraction is intensified by the Necronomicon's reputation as the book that drives you mad. Just as cursed videotapes or haunted websites appear in modern folklore, The Necronomicon carries an aura of info hazard. The idea that reading it is dangerous in itself. Several online accounts, almost certainly fictional, describe people going mad after reading certain passages. Others claim that even possessing a copy invites dreams, shadows, or personality changes. These stories persist not because they are credible, but because they obey the narrative logic of forbidden texts. The more one knows, the less one returns. Crucially, the Necronomicon's presence in real, world legend rarely involves full access. It is always almost found, almost read, almost purchased. This is not a failure of belief. It is the design of belief. A fully revealed Necronomicon would be subject to scrutiny. A half-glimpsed one is inexhaustible. In this way, the Necronomicon behaves like a cultural echo chamber. Each iteration, hoax, or sighting reaffirms its plausibility, pulling it further from fiction and deeper into contemporary folklore. It no longer belongs to Lovecraft. It belongs to the ritual of speculation, to every reader who has ever wondered if fiction might be hiding something ancient, unspoken, and dangerous. Once the Necronomicon crossed into popular consciousness, it became inevitable that it would migrate into other media. Film, games, and music did not merely borrow the name. They reinterpreted its function, reshaped its symbolism, and in many cases simplified its philosophical weight into something more immediately consumable. This process did not destroy the Necronomicon's power. It altered the form through which that power operated. The earliest cinematic appropriations already revealed this shift. Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead, 1981, introduced the Necronomicon Ex Mortis as a book bound in human flesh, inked in blood, and filled with incantations that summon demonic forces. Here, the Necronomicon becomes an engine of spectacle. It produces possession, violence, and grotesque transformation. This version is not a record of cosmic structure, but a trigger mechanism. It is dangerous because of what it does, not because of what it reveals. This represents a fundamental reinterpretation. Lovecraft's Necronomicon destabilizes reality through knowledge. Raimi's destabilizes bodies through ritual. The book shifts from epistemological horror to procedural horror. It becomes a prop of causality. Read the words, summon the entity, suffer the consequences. This clarity makes it cinematic. It also makes it safe. Other films attempted to restore ambiguity. Roman Polanski's The Ninth Gate, 1999, presents a fictional grimoire, the 9 gates of the Kingdom of Shadows, whose structure closely mirrors the Necronomicon mythos. Here, the book is incomplete, its pages inconsistent, its origins uncertain. Characters disagree over its meaning. Possession of the text promises transcendence, but delivers disorientation. The horror is not demonic attack, but interpretive instability. No one knows which copy is authentic. No one knows what the text truly does. Similarly, In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, frames the Necronomicon indirectly through the writings of a fictional author whose books rewrite reality by being read. This returns to Lovecraft's central insight, that certain texts do not describe the world. They alter it. Knowledge becomes a vector. Meaning becomes infection. Video games expanded this logic further. Titles such as Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, Eternal Darkness, Sanities, Requiem, 2002, and Bloodborne, 2015, incorporated Necronomicon-like texts as in-game artifacts that reduce sanity when read. This mechanic literalizes Lovecraft's metaphor. Knowledge has numerical cost. Insight drains stability. The player must decide whether understanding is worth fragmentation. We must pause here. This is not merely narrative borrowing. It is system design shaped by Lovecraftian philosophy. These games formalize epistemic collapse into gameplay loops. The more you know, the less control you possess. Progress and disintegration become indistinguishable. Music, particularly extreme metal and dark ambient, absorbed the Necronomicon as a symbolic lexicon. Bands such as Morbid Angel, Nile, and Behemoth referenced it not as a specific text, but as shorthand for cosmic hostility. Album titles, lyrics, and artwork borrowed its imagery: cyclopean ruins, alien geometries, blasphemous scripts. The Necronomicon became a semantic artifact. Its name alone signaled the presence of an inhuman scale. Dark ambient composers approached it differently. Artists like Lustmord and Atrium Carceri used the idea of forbidden texts to structure soundscapes that feel archival rather than expressive. These works resemble audio documents retrieved from abandoned libraries. The listener is positioned not as participant, but as researcher uncovering material not meant for circulation. Across these media, the Necronomicon undergoes a gradual transformation. It becomes visible, tangible, illustrated, explained, sometimes even cataloged. This visibility is double-edged. On one hand, it ensures cultural survival. On the other, it erodes the original horror, which depended on incompleteness. A comparison clarifies this process. Medieval depictions of angels began as abstract symbols. Over centuries, they acquired wings, faces, personalities. As they became clearer, they became less terrifying. The Necronomicon follows a similar path. The more it is shown, the less it destabilizes. And yet, something persists. Even in its most simplified form, the Necronomicon continues to represent a specific anxiety, that certain knowledge is not merely dangerous, but structurally incompatible with human life. Films reduce this to demons. Games translate it into sanity meters. Music compresses it into atmosphere. But the underlying idea remains intact. The book is not evil, it is accurate. And accuracy, in a universe not built for comprehension, remains the most unsettling possibility. As the Necronomicon migrated from literature into broader culture, it acquired a second life. Not as a book to be read, but as an idea to be used. In subcultures and academic discourse alike, it became a conceptual tool, a symbol for forbidden knowledge, epistemic instability, and the limits of interpretation. This appropriation did not dilute the Necronomicon's significance. It reframed it. The text ceased to be an object of horror and became a framework for thinking about horror itself. Within occult and esoteric subcultures, the Necronomicon was often treated with deliberate ambiguity. Chaos magic groups in the late 20th century embraced it not because they believed in Lovecraft's cosmology, but because they understood belief itself as a malleable instrument. In this context, the Necronomicon functioned as a psychodramatic engine. Practitioners invoked its symbols to generate altered states, not to summon entities, but to destabilize perception and identity. The book became a ritual fiction, useful precisely because it was known to be invented. This is not parody, it is methodology. Chaos magic treats narrative as a technology. Symbols are valuable insofar as they produce effects. The Necronomicon's dense associations, madness, ancientness, cosmic hostility, made it an ideal psychological catalyst. Not a sacred text, but a weaponized myth. In this sense, the book's fictional status did not weaken it. It made it safer to use. Parallel to This internet-based communities began treating the Necronomicon as a collaborative myth object. The SCP Foundation, ARG designers, and creepypasta writers adopted Lovecraftian logic wholesale. Fictional documents, redacted files, and forbidden archives became central storytelling devices. These texts were not meant to be consumed passively. They invited investigation, annotation, and expansion. The Necronomicon's DNA is unmistakable here. Fragmented documentation, unreliable narrators, and the implication that the reader's curiosity is itself a liability. We must pause here. This shift marks a crucial evolution. Lovecraft's horror was unilateral. The text overwhelms the reader. In these modern forms, horror becomes participatory. The audience is complicit. To read is to contribute. To theorize is to risk deeper entanglement. The Necronomicon thus becomes less a book than a protocol for generating unease through collective interpretation. Academia approached the Necronomicon from a different angle. Literary scholars quickly recognized it as a masterclass in metafiction. Jorge Luis Borges, though not directly engaging Lovecraft, explored similar terrain. Fictional texts treated with scholarly seriousness, libraries of books that should not exist, authors invented to legitimize ideas. From this perspective, the Necronomicon functions as a simulacrum, a copy without an original, sustained entirely through reference. Postmodern theory provides useful language here. Jean Baudrillard's concept of hyperreality describes symbols that become more real than reality itself. The Necronomicon fits this definition precisely. It is cited, cataloged, debated, and sold, often by people who have never read Lovecraft. Its cultural presence exceeds its textual one. It exists not on the page, but in the network of references surrounding it. Philosophers of horror, such as Eugene Thacker, later identified the Necronomicon as an exemplar of what he calls the world without us. In this framework, horror arises when thought encounters the limits of its own applicability. The Necronomicon is not frightening because it depicts monsters, but because it represents knowledge beyond correlation, truths that cannot be folded back into human meaning systems. Academic engagement with the text thus treats it as a philosophical thought experiment rather than a narrative device. Comparisons to religious studies further clarify its function. The Necronomicon behaves like Apocrypha. It is defined not by what it contains, but by what it is excluded from. Canonical texts promise coherence. Apocryphal ones threaten it. The Necronomicon's authority derives from its rejection. It is powerful because it is not sanctioned. This mirrors how forbidden books have historically attracted scholarly attention, not despite their marginality, but because of it. A rhetorical question emerges. Why does a fictional book command serious academic treatment? Because it exposes a vulnerability in how meaning is produced. The Necronomicon demonstrates that authority can be simulated, that scholarship can be mimicked, and that belief can arise without origin. It reveals that our trust in texts rests not on truth, but on form, repetition, and institutional context. In subcultural spaces, this realization becomes playful, transgressive, or ritualized. In academic spaces, it becomes analytical, critical, and abstract. But the underlying insight is the same. The Necronomicon is not important because it is feared. It is important because it reveals how fear is constructed through language, documentation, and tradition. The Necronomicon endures not because it frightens, but because it unsettles a foundational assumption, that knowledge is inherently beneficial. Long after its fictional origins are understood, the idea of the book continues to exert pressure on the modern psyche. It lingers as a thought experiment that refuses resolution. What if some truths do not liberate? What if understanding is not a ladder upward, but a solvent that dissolves the self who climbs? At a psychological level, the Necronomicon crystallizes a fear that has grown more acute with modernity. The fear that reality, when fully examined, may be incompatible with human meaning-making. In Lovecraft's time, this anxiety emerged alongside scientific revolutions that displaced humanity from the center of the cosmos. In our own era, it resurfaces through data overload, algorithmic governance, and the erosion of shared narratives. The Necronomicon functions as a symbolic precursor to these conditions. It imagines a world where correlation outpaces comprehension. We must pause here. The book's most disturbing implication is not that reality is hostile, but that it is indifferent to interpretation. Human psychology depends on coherence, causal stories, moral arcs, stable identities. The Necronomicon suggests these are coping mechanisms, not reflections of structure. When those mechanisms fail, what remains is not madness as chaos, but madness as excess clarity. The individual sees too much, connects too much, and can no longer inhabit the simplifications required for daily life. This idea resonates strongly with contemporary philosophy of mind. Cognitive scientists increasingly describe consciousness as a filtering process, a reduction of overwhelming sensory and conceptual input into a survivable model. From this perspective, sanity is not accuracy, it is compression. The Necronomicon represents the removal of that compression. It imagines a mind forced to process reality at full resolution. The result is not enlightenment. It is collapse. Philosophically, the book gestures toward a bleak conclusion. Meaning may not be an emergent property of the universe, but a local hallucination sustained by biological necessity. The Necronomicon does not argue this explicitly. It implies it through structure, its fragmentary nature, its refusal to cohere, its resistance to complete quotation. All mirror a universe that does not assemble itself into narrative. Not chaos, but non-narrativity. Consider the difference. Chaos still implies disruption of order. Non-narrativity implies that order was never present to begin with. This is why the Necronomicon's horror feels deeper than nihilism. Nihilism denies meaning. The Necronomicon suggests that meaning is irrelevant, a side effect of human perception with no bearing on cosmic structure. A rhetorical question becomes unavoidable. How does one live with this implication? Lovecraft offers no answer, and that silence is intentional. His characters either retreat into ignorance, dissolve into madness, or survive as diminished custodians of terrible awareness. There is no synthesis, no reconciliation. The Necronomicon does not teach coping strategies. It records consequences. This absence of resolution is precisely why the book continues to haunt culture. Modern audiences are increasingly confronted with systems, ecological, technological, informational, that exceed individual understanding. Climate models, neural networks, global supply chains. These structures operate at scales that resist intuitive comprehension. The Necronomicon becomes a metaphor for this condition. It is the unreadable manual of a world that continues to function regardless of our capacity to grasp it. Comparisons clarify this role. In earlier centuries, forbidden books were feared because they challenged authority. Today, the Necronomicon is feared because it challenges coherence itself. It is not heretical. It is decentering. It suggests that the universe does not care whether it is understood, misunderstood, or mythologized. All interpretations are equally inconsequential. Yet the human response persists. We keep inventing Necronomicons, fictional documents, leaked files, redacted reports, conspiracy archives. Each promises access to the real story beneath appearances, and each repeats the same pattern: partial revelation, interpretive overload, psychological unease. The pattern is not accidental. It reflects a species struggling with the possibility that total knowledge is not survivable. This reveals something profound. The Necronomicon is not ultimately about monsters, cults, or ancient gods. It is about limits: the limit of language, the limit of cognition, the limit of what can be known without losing the framework that allows knowing to matter. It dramatizes the possibility that the universe may be fully intelligible, and that such intelligibility would be catastrophic. In closing, the Necronomicon endures because it articulates a fear that cannot be exorcised, that truth and sanity are not aligned goals, that survival may depend on selective blindness, that some doors, once opened, do not lead to power or wisdom, but to an awareness so vast it erases the self who sought it. The book does not warn us away, it simply exists, waiting in the iwisi, cultural imagination, as a reminder that curiosity is not always rewarded, and that some questions, once asked, cannot be safely answered.